coming. Appreciate your attendance. I wasn't really anticipating many people to come to this, so I'm not just being self-effacing or humble. I thought it would be like a workshop discussion interaction thing, but that might just need to be rethought a little bit as we go. So I do appreciate it. I do appreciate people sitting against the wall. Just a short word to those people. If you could not check messages and text and Twitter and things, it just looks bad. You know, it's just like, if you could, because they can all see you. So if you could just look in rapt appreciation, everything that I say, that's going to look much better. My name is Michael Frost, and I am from Sydney, Australia, although I've just come from Europe. I was in Prague and Budapest speaking at some events over there, and actually, you know, in the Southern Hemisphere, we think everything in the Northern Hemisphere is all close to each other. So someone said, oh, well, will you come to Exponential? It's like, well, it could kind of fit at the end of this Prague-Budapest thing. And they said, yeah, no, that'd work perfectly. I said, and it's like, it's not that far. I mean, it's just like across the, you know. So when I got on board in London and they said, how do I turn the volume up? Oh, I have to operate this as well? I mean, come on. There's like 100 buttons on that thing. Can you hear me now better? Yes. So as I was saying, I was thinking it would just be quite simple, and then I got on the plane at London. It was like, it'll be 9 hours flying to Orlando. I thought, I could be in Sydney in nearly that time, I would have thought. So maybe not, but nearly. So here I am at the end of a sort of a trip, and I was really looking forward to an intimate interaction with Americans around the whole issue of post-Christendom and what shape it takes and what it means for Americans. But I might just have to make a few guesses on that account and press forward. See, when you come from Australia, and in particular, if you've spent any time in Europe, as I just said I have just done, we are peculiarly aware of the particular social phenomenon of finding ourselves in a post-Christian kind of context. I don't just mean post-Christian in the sense that there are now less people going to church than there ever were. I mean post-Christendom in the sense that the arrangement that was made in Europe and Australians being British by heritage in the United Kingdom was a deal done, a Faustian deal done between the church and the state. A deal that did very nicely for the state and not terribly well for the church, as G.K. Chesterton pointed out. So when you are in a place like the Czech Republic or Hungary, both of which have been former communist countries under the Soviet regime, you see just the end point of what it looks like for the Christian story, not just for church attendance to have dropped, which it certainly has, but you see the end point of what it looks like for the Christian story to have no bearing whatever on the social, political, cultural, personal reality of the Czechs or the Hungarians in that case. And I would say those of us either from the UK or from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, we know what it's like to be nearly at that particular point. While in the United States, of course, it's not so much one nation, is it? I mean, it's such an enormous country with so many different kind of Christian expressions. There are many, many, many Christian Americans now understanding what it is like in their own context for the Christian story to have no shaping bearing on the culture of the cities of which they're part. And others of you, that might not be so obvious. But as I've always said, whenever I come to the United States, basically I come from your future. You want to know where you're headed, you know, have a look at the United Kingdom, have a look at Australia. And if you really want to know where you're ultimately headed, go and have a look at Prague or Budapest or Paris or Berlin. This is the trajectory that Western civilization is on. So the question that arises for those of us that are not able to rely on the state, as it were, not able to rely on kind of the cultural and social rhythms of our cities or our nations to reinforce or value the Christian story or church attendance or religious faith even. If there's nothing, there's no struts, there's no support, there's no scaffolding socially and culturally for us, what does it mean for us to seek to be faithful to the gospel in a context like that? No one's applauding us for church attendance. No one's happy that the church is in the country. Most people see it as entirely anachronistic. They smile on it in some kind of a patronising fashion, in the same way that everyone kind of smiles in a patronising fashion about the royal wedding that's about to take place. It's kind of, isn't it sweet? Isn't it lovely? It's cute, isn't it? It's so beautiful that these kind of traditions still last. But it means nothing to us. It bears in no way upon us. And in many respects, that's the way church is seen in my country. And as I said, more and more in many cities across the United States. So what does it mean for us to seek to be faithful followers of Jesus in such a post-Christendom or post-Christian context? Does it simply mean to be louder and better at what we have always done? Or does it require us to think in an entirely different paradigm about being Christians in post-Christendom? Some of the people that have been most helpful for me have been Old Testament scholars who have tried to work through in what ways did the Hebrew community maintain its faith in Yahweh whilst in exile in Babylon, more specifically Babylon, but also potentially in Egypt. I mean, there is an example, is there not, from Scripture of what it is like for a group of faithful ones, followers of Yahweh, in a context which is entirely non-Jewish or non-Hebrew. It's not like their culture changed, it's not like the ground slipped out from under them in the same way as we might say has happened to the Christian community, but it is nonetheless the same kind of end point. What does it mean for you to be a faithful follower of Yahweh in Babylon? How did they do it? How did they sustain their faith when there was absolutely no social, cultural, religious, no struts or supports or scaffolding to support them worshipping or following Yahweh in that context?
Are you wanting the projector?
No, I'm not.
You need to be louder.
Oh, this is more volume. Okay.
I would do it, except I wouldn't be able to choose which of the 55 buttons I had to twiddle there. So here's the particular agenda that many of us have looked at. What does it mean for us to read the exilic literature from the Old Testament through the lens of the gospel and ask ourselves, how did Hebrew exiles maintain their faith? I mean, the remarkable thing about the post-exilic Jewish experience is that Judaism was actually stronger as a result of its period in exile. That is, rediscovery of some of its core liturgical practices and beliefs emerge actually out of the experience of exile. So far from being crushed or destroyed or in any way diluted, in fact the experience of exile was incredibly galvanizing. So rather than bemoaning the dreadful or parlous state that we find ourselves in a post-Christian or emergingly post-Christian America, rather than bemoaning the fact in my country that no one says prayers at the opening of Parliament or that no one goes to church at Easter, rather than boo-hoo, wah, wah, why doesn't anybody want to be a Christian anymore, is it not possible for us to dare to imagine maybe this experience of exile, if I put it in inverted commas, could actually be the very ground from which we rediscover what it is to be a faithful follower of Jesus in our context. Does this make sense? I mean, you can complain all you like that there are no prayers in school or that the president isn't Christian enough for you or whatever the case may be, but I suggest to you, don't rely on social or cultural scaffolding to reinforce faithful following of Jesus. Ask yourself, if the ground has slipped out from under us, if we are no longer in Kansas, Toto, and everything is sort of different for us, is this not potentially or possibly an enormous opportunity as much as it is a difficult challenge? So a number of years ago I wrote a book called Exiles, where I reimagined what it would be like for us as exilic followers of Jesus in post-Christendom West. And I sought to take the core practices of the Hebrew exilic experience and apply them insofar as you can into our own experience today. And I discovered, thanks to particularly work of people like Walter Brueggemann and Tom Wright and other people like that there is actually some genius, some brilliance behind the ways in which the Jewish community sustained or maintained their faith when nothing else supported them in any way whatsoever. You can have something as dramatic and marvellous and breathtakingly ridiculous as Isaiah saying, "How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who shout and declare across Babylon the message which is what? Our God reigns. Now, it's breathtaking in its stupidity, is it not? How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who here in Babylon will declare the gospel of Israel, which is Yahweh reigns. You've got no temple, you've got no priesthood, you've got no king, you've got no land, you've got absolutely nothing. You're a totally marginalized group of slaves within a conquered environment. Your king is installed as a puppet king. You're a laughing stock. But what does Isaiah say? We will say it, even in the tsunami of evil in which we find ourselves. We will shout it. Our God reigns, even if all the evidence is to the contrary. So where does that level of absolute confidence in the kingdom or the reign or rule of Yahweh come from when there's no evidence, there's nothing that would reinforce such faith or belief? And my big fear is for the American church is that if you put your stock too much in cultural indicators reinforcing church going or personal faith, you'll be sorely disappointed by that. But if you can find out what it's like to declare that our God reigns through Christ in the midst of the tsunami of unbelief that is coming your way, you will have discovered something of the internal genius of the exilic experience. So 4 things I think you can distill from the Jewish or Hebrew exile experience and apply them into the current Christian experience. As I said, this will relate more to those of you who are from Prague or Budapest or Sydney or London than it might for those of you who come from the kind of Christian south of the United States. They are these. The first thing is this. The Hebrew community is forced back to rediscover its most primal and most dangerous story. The remarkable thing about an exiled community, you know, I imagine some of you might even have come from, say, exiled communities. Some of you might come from immigrant communities here in the United States. You will know what immigrant Germans or immigrant Koreans are like when they are telling stories about what it is to be German or what it is to be Korean or whatever the case may be. More often than not, these stories are highly sentimental and romantic, are they not? Like, remember the days in Germany when it was just like this? I remember, you know, in Korea you could go to the local store and always buy that. They were kind of sentimentalized, romanticized ideas, nostalgic ideas of what life was like back in Sweden or Germany or wherever it might happen to have been the case. But this is not what you find the exilic community doing in Babylon. Far from enshrining their belief or love of the good old days. I remember when the temple was on the mount, or wasn't it wonderful when your taxi driver was Jewish and your butcher was Jewish and everyone was Jewish. Rather than these nostalgic, idealized stories about the good old days, what story becomes primal, central, absolute, non-negotiable, and told over and over and over in the exilic experience? The most radical, most dangerous, most daring, most seditious story of all. And the story is? It's the Exodus. Now you imagine telling that story, which is a story of what? It's the story of how Yahweh kicked the ass of the superpower of Egypt. You tell that story while you are in exile under another superpower. That's seditious. That's politically dangerous. But that story, the story of how God, how Yahweh remained faithful to his people even when they were in exile, he set them free, our God reigns. That becomes their primal story. So that is why the breaking of the bread, the drinking of the wine, the reminder again and again and again that our God protected us, that the angel of death passed over us, that God set us free. You are telling your most primal, most dangerous and most seditious story, and you tell it to your children every single Friday night. You light a candle, you break bread, you report again and again and again. If he did it once, he'll do it again, even in the midst of the evil empire in which we find ourselves. So they are forced back to the most dangerous or primal or defining story. I remember reading Stanley Hauerwas's book, Toward a Community of Character, where he kind of exegetes that kind of crazy, funky book, Watership Down. You know, Watership Down, about these kind of weird messianic rabbits. What is Watership Down about? It's about this rabbit who feels in his little cotton tail that something's up, something's bad, something's happening, we've got to get out of here. So he runs around to all these other rabbits in the cool, cool earth and says, we've got to go, we've got to go. Well, why have we got to go? We're rabbits. What do rabbits do? We dig. We live in the cool, cool earth. But no, he feels it in the very depths of his soul. And he gathers around him a small messianic band and convinces them that they must escape. And up out of the warren they go, and out across the open fields, just as the great bulldozers come in to churn up the common. There's no turning back. They're an exiled community. And off they go in search of Watership Down, in search of kind of rabbit heaven. Now, what Hauerwas says is, if you read the book, you notice what happens. What keeps them running? What keeps them going? Because, in fact, in the book, they encounter various rabbit communities that have certain things to offer and certain fears and anxieties nonetheless. But they encounter versions, if you like, of Watership Down. So what keeps them going? Well, why do they continue to run? And, in fact, what you discover in the book is they have to do all these incredibly un-rabbit-like things. They have to run out across open fields in the daylight. They have to cross rivers. They have to run through forests infested with foxes. I mean, rabbits don't do this stuff. Like, rabbits dig, and stay in the cool, cool earth. They do something else as well, but, I mean... Which reminds me of the joke about the two rabbits being chased by a pack of dogs, and the male rabbit pulls the female rabbit behind the tree and says, "Quick, let's outnumber them." Well, in Hauerwas's exegesis of Watership Down, he answers the question, this is what keeps them running. This is what keeps them searching. This is what countermands every part of their rabbit DNA, when everything in their very bones says, stop, dig, be safe, live in the cool, cool earth. What is it that lifts them up and sends them out across the open fields? He says, if you read Watership Down, you'll realise that they regularly stop and recount the stories of the great mythical rabbit, the first rabbit created, the one who received the so-called blessings of the gifts of the rabbit. They tell the stories of El Harahe, the great ancestor of their experience, the stories that they were told as small bunnies at bedtime by their parents. And what Hauerwas says is this, the thing that keeps them running, the thing that keeps them going, when everything says to them, stop, be safe. What countermands every internal intuition? It is the stories of El Harahe. He says they are a story-formed community, and it is the story that drives them forward. This is exactly the experience of the Jewish exiles, is it not? They are not formed by liturgy because they cannot practice it openly. It all moves into homes. They are not formed by their priesthood or by their king or by their land. They have no external basis for understanding who they are as a people, what defines them as a people, their most dangerous story. We are the ones that Yahweh will protect and set free, just as he did when we were in Egypt. In the same respect then, folks, does it not follow that for us, as exiled, as it were, Christians, in a post-Christian experience, what ought we to do but to fall back upon our most dangerous story of all? Not the story about the day when our church had a choir of 500 people, or not the great stories about how this church used to be packed one day, or not the stories of nostalgia like the good old days growing up a Baptist in, Georgia somewhere. Nostalgia will move us nowhere. But we go back to break bread and to drink wine, and we tell this most radical and dangerous story, that God, that Yahweh, inhabited flesh, became one of us in order to redeem us. The most radical and dangerous story that we have is the story of the gospel. Amen. And we tell it like it's a kid's bedtime story. There should be no such thing as children's bedtime story Bibles, right? I mean, imagine that. Okay, honey, and then Jesus said, I hate your mother and your father. Good night, off to sleep now. And then he said, now go and sell everything and give it to the poor. Good night, sleep tight, darling. Imagine these kids like, these are dangerous stories, are they not? That actually Yahweh, King and ruler of all, considers it possible to inhabit human flesh and to live among us, to realise that we are for Jesus, for Yahweh, a pleasant place of shelter, that we are freed from being defined by our liturgy, by our buildings, by our traditions. We're Presbyterians, so we don't do such and such. We're Baptists, so we always do such and such. No, my friends, you are like a band of messianic rabbits. You have been set free from the common. You're out across the open field. There's no turning back. So what will form you as a community? You will stop. You will break bread. You will drink wine. You will tell the story again and again and again. Our God took on flesh. It is possible. It is possible to be accepted and loved by the Holy One because he showed us it's not evil and despicable to be us. And when we enter into relationship with him, we are set free from fear and sin and death and the devil. Do you follow? You ought to break that bread and drink that wine every night with your family. You ought to tell that story over and over and over. And yet I've been in your churches and I know how you tell the story. It's like, get this one over as quickly as we can. We've got to get on to the sermon, the 6 ways to have a happy marriage. We've got 8 songs we've got to get through today before we can do this. And so quickly, pass the elements around. We do this once a year, so be quick, hurry up. We need to be forced back to that story as radical, frightening, dangerous, seditious. A story that is actually un-American. A story that challenges American values. It may affirm a number of American values as well, but it is a seditious story told by exiles right under the nose of the empire in which we find ourselves. Do you follow? I don't want any more sanitized, child-oriented stories about Jesus. He's wild, he's dangerous, he's frightening. He's so dangerous, in fact, that the people who understood him best were not his disciples. They were the ones who wanted him dead. Not silenced, not marginalised, dead. His first sermon, they push him to the top of a cliff and are about to kill him. You want to preach like Jesus? You need people who want to kill you at the end of that sermon. So we need to be defined by our story as the most radical and most dangerous thing. Not by our own traditions and liturgies and backgrounds, but by that fundamental story of the radical love of God who waded into our world. I remember being at an emerging church conference once and walked into the sanctuary. It was a very traditional looking church, had big columns out the front and stained glass. They'd emptied the whole place out. Wasn't a stick of religious furniture in the place. They'd covered the floor with black plastic. And in the middle of the church sanctuary, they had brought in a mountain of rubbish. Not like cardboard boxes and paper, like food scraps, rubbish from your kitchen. Like there were fish bones and meat bones and food and vegetable scraps. There was like little trails of vegetable and rubbish juice sort of trailing out from this mountain. That's all there was in the building. With no introduction or anything, we were all asked just to sort of come in. All you could do was stand around the stinking, rotting pile of garbage. And then 2 men came out from the 2 doors at the front of the sanctuary, wearing kind of robes, looking sort of like monks, if you like. They moved toward the mountain of rubbish, and there were 4 screens in each corner, or 1 in each corner. We were led through a series of prayers and responsive readings and the like, moving toward the celebration of the Lord's Supper. I've celebrated the Lord's Supper in many churches and forgotten what they were like, but I've never, ever in my life forgotten this. Because as we came to celebrate the Lord's Supper, to eat and to drink, these men removed their robes and they were wearing Speedos. Then they moved toward the pile of garbage and they waded into it. They were up to their waists in food scraps, milk bottles, garbage, vegetable peelings. And then one of them looked down, and into the pile or mountain of garbage they lifted up a bottle of wine in a brown paper bag. The other one looked down and reached down and brought out a loaf of bread, thankfully wrapped in plastic. And these two men said to us, when we eat of this bread and we drink of this wine, we do celebrate the death of Jesus as the atoning sacrifice for our sins. And we do celebrate the resurrection of Jesus as his defeat of sin and death and the devil. But when we eat of this feast, we also celebrate that our God, holy, pure, pristine and perfect, took on flesh and waded into all the shit and crap and garbage of this world. And so if you choose to eat this bread and drink this wine, you take off your shoes, you roll up your trouser legs, you hitch up your dress or skirt, and you come into this rubbish to receive the bread and the wine. And by so doing, you will say this. You will say, Lord Jesus, in eating this bread and drinking this wine, I acknowledge that the incarnation itself was an overwhelming burden for you to bear. And just as the Father has sent you into this world, so I ask, Lord, send me. I have never forgotten tiptoeing into that garbage juice squelching between my toes, that bread sticking to the roof of my mouth, that swig of wine washing down all my anxiety and fear. This is our story. Our God did this that we might be free. And he says to his friends, just as the Father sent me, so I send you. He's not just telling us we're sent, he's telling us the manner in which we are sent, just like I was. You tell that story, and you tell it over and over and over, because it is the story that forms us as exiles in a post-Christian world. Second thing that we discover is that exiles practice very, very dangerous criticism of the empire of which they're part. You'll notice some of the most famous exiles are the ones who are most prepared to critique the empire and to resist it, are they not? I mean, you have a look at the impact that Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, have. Is it like, what does the great emperor do? What does the king of the world do? What does the ruler of the whole known world do? He creates an enormous image of himself on the plains outside of the city, effectively a massive phallic symbol. And he says to everyone there, as soon as you hear the imperial orchestra strike up, you shall face this image of me, this image of my fertility and power, and you will bend your knee and you will worship me. Otherwise, I will throw you into the imperial furnace. Now, you know as well as I do, you don't want to be part of any place that's got an imperial furnace, right? I'm a little anxious about imperial orchestras myself as well, but that's another story. And of course, we know Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they refused to bend their knee, do they not? And yet there's this marvellous critique of the empire. When they brought toward the imperial furnace and they're asked to recant, well, what do they say? They don't say, we're confident the Lord will protect us. We've got nothing to fear. What do they say? Even if we are consumed. Burn us. Do your worst. But even if we are consumed, we will not bend our knee to your ridiculous and pathetic and embarrassing phallic symbol. And this is poking your finger in the chest of the empire, is it? Sometimes it's done in this dramatic and wild way. Sometimes, like as in Daniel's case, it's simply, just bring me raw vegetables and fruit. I just won't participate in the whole gourmandizing of the temple. Sometimes it's a passive or silent resistance. Sometimes it's overt and outspoken. But how do exiles manage to maintain their sense of identity in a post-Christian, or in their case, a non-Jewish context, they resist. They stand against. I mean, poking your finger in the chest of the emperor is never a good thing to do, because you do end up being thrown into imperial furnaces, don't you? It's like when Pontius Pilate says to Jesus, as he's brought Jesus and Barabbas before the baying crowd. And both of them, they're meant to perform, aren't they? They're meant to kind of drum up the crowd. It's like American Idol. It's like, call the number on the bottom of your screen, like, vote for me, vote for me. And Barabbas, no doubt, is like, yeah, vote for me, like, let's set me free. And Jesus, he stands there, silent, covered in blood, beaten to a pulp, his face torn to shreds by thorns. And Pilate turns to him and says, classic expression of imperial arrogance. He says, beg. Don't you know who I am? I have the power to free you or to condemn you. Jesus turns to him, and through his split lip, his broken teeth, his shattered face, Jesus turns to him and says, you have no power, but the power my Father grants you. And into the imperial furnace he goes. Friends, we need to resist. We need to be prepared to make a dangerous critique of our culture. I was only talking to a man the other day. He said that when he removed the American flag from his church, there was outrage in his community. Man, we're beholden to the empire. And don't mishear me. I'm not suggesting the American empire is as evil as Nebuchadnezzar's empire, but it's an empire, folks. And there are times when we need to be prepared to stand up and to say, no, this far but no further. There are times when we have to champion the cause of the poor or the broken or the marginalised. There are times when we have to champion the cause of the unborn or the lost or the brokenhearted. There are times when we just say, throw me into the furnace if that's what it comes to. And even if I'm consumed, still I will not bend my knee. That is what unites us as a people within an empire, a context which is not supportive or encouraging of who we are or of what we do. But by the same token, thirdly, just as exiles practice a dangerous form of criticism, they also make radically dangerous promises to the empire of which they're part. And to me, this is one of the most astonishing and surprising expressions of the Jewish exilic experience. In both Egypt, you could even say in Persia with Esther, and in Babylon with Daniel. What do you find the people of God doing? They make the empire a better empire. Is that not extraordinary? It's like, what does Joseph do in Egypt? He actually reorganizes their whole agricultural system. He blesses Egypt. Egypt is better being Egypt because the exiles are there. Likewise with Babylon. What does it mean for us to be the people of God in the empire? Not just to critique it as though we are some kind of ghetto of believers, but in fact to infiltrate it, to bring salt and light and grace and peace even right into an evil empire which is either oppressing us or marginalising us or ignoring us. And that is the most counterintuitive way to be an exile. Don't you agree? I mean, you would have thought to yourself, you Babylonian bastards, you're taking me, I should point out, some of this language I'm using, it's perfectly acceptable in Australian Christian circles. It's just a cultural issue, nothing to worry about. You would imagine that they would say, you guys stole my land, you killed my father, you swept me into exile. What would I want to do anything for you for? But in fact, what Jewish exiles do is that they add flavour, they add wisdom, they add grace, they bless the empire of which they are part. It is astonishing. And I need to ask you folks, to what degree, as exiles in your neighbourhood, do you see yourselves as the ones given to that neighbourhood? Not to resist, not to hunker down, not to kind of wait it out, but in fact in an exilic sense, to say, we'll reorganise your whole agricultural system for you, if you like. We'll actually bring kind of salt and light and peace and mercy into this context. That's what makes us the people of God. We are no longer defined by buildings. We are no longer defined by resistance. What we do is we engage, and that engagement means dangerous criticism, but it also means making dangerous promises. Your city will be a better city because we are here. Make that promise. When we planted our church, we were underground for a while. 6 months of kind of meeting and praying and worshipping in homes before we did anything that was public at all. I'm from Sydney. I was in Melbourne. A woman came up to me. We'd not announced anything. This woman came up to me and she said, the Lord has given me a word for you. If you've done any kind of itinerant speaking, you'll know that this happens quite often, won't you? Like people have words for you. They're nice. More often than not, they refer to eagles or butterflies. There's a lot of waterfall action happening as well. So my territory is going to be expanded, something along those lines. So you feel like saying, I'm going to soar above, I'm a beautiful butterfly. She said, God has told me to tell you this. A day will come where if you're, she said, God's telling me you're planting a church. I said, yeah, but we're not telling anyone about that. Right. She said, well, that confirms it because God has told me to tell you that a day will come where if your church was taken away from its neighbourhood, that neighbourhood would grieve for its loss. 9 years on, folks, and we're starting to see traces of it. I live for it. I've forgotten all the specifics of the butterflies and the waterfall prophecies, but I have never forgotten that word. I yearn for the day where if we were snuffed out or taken away, they would ask themselves, how are we to know what wisdom would be without them? How do we know what peace looks like without them? Oh my gosh, we're in trouble. How do we know what beauty looks like without them? Bring dangerous promises to your city. We will love. We will serve. We will give. We will bless. I think it's Tom Wright who says, the three primary evidences of the reign of God breaking out in your neighbourhood are reconciled relationships, social justice, and redeemed beauty. So just make a few promises. We will reconcile relationships in this city. We will bring social justice in this city. We will show you what real beauty looks like. Friends, make some dangerous promises like that. Why are they dangerous? They're dangerous because when you promise them, your city will hold you to them. Your city ain't going to like you very much when you practice a dangerous form of critique. They're not going to like it when you stick your finger in the chest of the emperor. We know that. But when you say, you want to know what love looks like? Check this out. They will watch. So don't put the sign up out the front, come on in and see how much we love each other, unless you're pretty sure that that's what it really looks like. But these are the promises that the Hebrew community makes. They're thrown back on their most dangerous and radical story. They practice a very dangerous form of critique right under the emperor's nose. They practice and make a set of very dangerous promises to actually add value and bless the community of which they're part. When Jesus was scouting around for a collective noun to describe his followers, there was no such word, was there? A collective noun for the followers of Jesus. What word would that be? So he takes a word, ecclesia, which we translate into English as church. That word was already in colloquial use, right? He didn't invent it. He didn't say, okay, here's a brand new word. You've never heard of it before. My followers are going to be called the church. Now, there was already ecclesias happening in Israel at that time. He takes that idea and actually turns that into something grander. And in fact, then Paul gets his hands on it and actually brings even greater complexity to it. But have you ever asked yourself, well, what did that word originally mean before Jesus took hold of it? I mean, how did people use it? Well, here's what an ecclesia was. In Jesus' time, whenever a man became the age of, he could be like mid-30s, his son had become 20 or so. He was now married, he could take over the family business. A man in his mid to late 30s could be old enough to have handed over his family business to his son. Here are all the carpentry tools, son. Here's the list of orders of tables and chairs to be made. It's all yours now. You're a man, you're married. Call me in if you've got a big order that comes in. Call me in if you need a hand. But essentially you now are the leader of this business. Or here's the flock of sheep. It's all yours. When you need to shear them, give me a call. I'll come back and help you. But you now run this business. So what did a man in his mid to late 30s and onward, what did he do if he was now no longer a carpenter or a shepherd or a craftsman? I mean, he went and played golf in Florida, or what do you do if you're like retired that early in life? Well, we know what they did. The elders of the city would all go down and sit at the city gate. Now, I'm kind of romantic in my notions about city gates. I imagine them to be like Lord of the Rings style, big kind of sweeping archways and vats of boiling oil and things like that. But it was probably just an opening in a brush fence around the small village in which they lived. And you would sit there at the city gate. But this was not just a place just to hang out like a retirement village, or a place where you just kind of drink coffee and hang out and tell old stories. This particular gathering at the city gate fulfilled a very, very important function. You see, whenever there was a dilemma or a question or a problem or a concern in the village, you would go straight to these men to ask their advice. So, if there's conflict between the Smiths and the Joneses and we can't resolve it, we take them down to the city gate and you say, fathers of mine, uncles and grandfathers of mine, the Smiths and the Joneses are warring with each other. How do you think we should address this? Or if there's a drought, or if there's a flood, or if there's a fantastic crop, you go to your elders and you say, you are the repository of wisdom and insight in our village. Tell us, how should we respond to this? Now, I've spoken to a missionary who's actually sat with elders at a city gate and listened to them engaging with these kinds of issues. And he said the rule of the discussion is that no one should provide the solution too early in the day. All you can do is add enough into the conversation to keep it going. The idea being it should take a whole day of us ruminating and little bits of information coming in, and slowly we come to the conclusion. So if the Smiths and the Joneses are warring, and you as an elder happen to say, I think he should do this and she should do that and they should do this, all the other elders would go, man, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Like, what are we going to do for the rest of the day? Like, these men would sit there and they would add wisdom. Now, there are traces of this in the Gospels. Are you familiar with the story where a man comes to Jesus and says, Rabbi, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me? Why would a guy run up to Jesus and ask him to do that? Because he has probably gone to the elders in his tribe, his village, and they have not either given him a satisfactory answer, or it hasn't gone in his favour, or they haven't yet come up with a solution. And so it was a tradition, if you could find an elder, a well-known thinker, a rabbi, to side with you on something like that, that put enormous social pressure on your brother and he'd have to cave. So this man has gone to Jesus as an elder, as a rabbi, a man in his 30s, and said, tell my brother to sort this out. He might have been offering something perfectly reasonable, we don't know. But what's Jesus' first response? It's like, hello, who made me a judge, an elder over you? You don't outsource this from your village, your town. What do you think you're doing? Oh, listen, before you go, come back here, I've got a story to tell you. Whenever Jesus had a story to tell you, you knew it was not going to go well for you. A certain man, his ground gave rise to a bumper crop. He's now got more money than he knows what to do with. Now, you know what a group of Jews in Israel hearing that story would be thinking? God has blessed this man enormously, has he not? Like, oh, he's the hero of the story. Let's hear more. What did he do? Well, then he said to himself, the whole story swings on that, doesn't it? Then he said to himself, I know what I will do. I will tend, I will build, I will... Everyone in the room would have been like, what? If your ground gives rise to a bumper crop, you got more money than you know what to do with, what do? You go down to the city gate. You say, fathers of mine, uncles of mine, grandfathers of mine, I've got more money than I know what to do with. What should I do? And the elders would tell you to feed the poor, to hold a party. The elders might tell you to build bigger barns eventually. But it would have been done in the context of the repository of wisdom within the context of the neighbourhood or village in which you live. Does this make sense? Now, the term that was used to describe the gathering of the called out ones at the city gate was ecclesia. It was a civic function. It does have a religious dimension or a liturgical dimension in some other contexts, but it also has this strong civic sense. The ecclesia are the ones who are called out, who are the repository of wisdom, of grace, and not external to the community, but wedded to the outcome of whatever wisdom they might happen to offer. Again, does this make sense to you? Jesus takes that word. It's canny, isn't it? He takes that term and he adds to it. Paul then again, as I said, adds to it. But the raw material is this. The followers of Jesus will make dangerous promises to their city. They will say, we will offer wisdom, grace and peace. And now it's no longer just older men who qualify. Now our wisdom doesn't come from our age or our experience. It comes from the indwelling Spirit of God. Young men, young women, older women, we are God's gift to your community. So if your church was taken away tomorrow, would your neighbourhood grieve? Would your city feel lost? What promises have you made? To what degree do you add salt and light into a community desperate to know the things that we've been revealed to us? And then fourthly and quickly, just to finish up with, Walter Brueggemann said this, and I found it so provocative. He said, Jews in exile sing dangerous songs. Their worship, their liturgical life, is filled with seditious power. If you read the second half of Isaiah, I dare not say second Isaiah here in this context, but the second part of Isaiah, what you will discover there are a series of lyrics for songs, effectively, are they not? And they are wild and radical songs. What are they songs about? They're songs about a day will come where we will plant our crops and no one will take what we have grown. We will build our houses and no one will evict us from them. A day will come where it is considered young to be 100 years of age. A day will come when children won't die for lack of health care in childbirth. A day will come. These people sing up the world that they imagine that Yahweh is going to create for them, right under the noses of people who hold them in oppression and marginalisation and poverty. I mean, their worship is worship of the world which is to come. They're dangerous and wild songs. In fact, there's a passage in the second part of Isaiah where Yahweh says, I have heard your songs and now I will sing to you. And as I sing like a woman in childbirth. I've always thought to myself, with this voice, I could sing like that. I will sing up a whole new world that I'm birthing through you, people of Israel, through my Son and Saviour, Jesus, who will bring this world to the Gentiles and the whole planet. When we sing up the world. When we sing dangerously. When you think about it, there isn't a single revolution that's ever happened in history that wasn't sung into existence before it was enacted. Don't you agree? I mean, even those, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, fascist or communist, whether it's a democratic movement, doesn't matter. They sing up the world that they're dreaming of before they ever march into the streets. In the United States, what was the civil rights movement if it was not a sung revolution before it was an enacted revolution? In South Africa, certain hymns and Christmas carols were banned from public use because they actually declared peace on earth and goodwill to all men. These were seditious songs. You don't sing this sort of stuff. I would love it if the governor of your state tried to ban a few of your worship songs. But who's going to ban cloying romantic love songs to Jesus? Who cares if you sing that? Knock yourselves out. We don't care. But when you start singing about a world which is not this world, but a world which is to come, when you start singing about a world of redeemed pleasure, when you start singing about a world of justice and of mercy and of peace, when you start singing like a woman in childbirth, groaning and dreaming that there's got to be something more, that is going to be given birth by the Spirit of God in this world, then you're singing like an exile. But we don't sing like exiles when all we do is sing about how Jesus loves me like a precious snowflake. It's romanticised, personalised, powerless, neurotic spirituality. What you find in the Hebrew community is muscular, dynamic, energized worship, which knows that Nebuchadnezzar is not the last word, who knows that Yahweh will set them free, who know that in the meantime their calling is to resist that empire and to bless that empire, and who every time they meet and every time they eat, they taste that bread and they drink that wine, and that story is the one that makes them this wild and radical band of exiles. Be that. Be that in an emerging post-Christian America. Pray for those of us in former British colonies, Western, Eastern, Central Europe, and visit us. Come to us. Peek into your future. Because the stakes are very, very high. And more of the same is not doing the trick. God bless you and thank you for your time.